Great. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I see Cecily there. Nice to meet finally in person. Okay, so the title of the talk is Brain the Size of a Planet. What should we be discussing with Chat GPT? I'm Manny Rayner. So I'm going to start off by just saying a few words about Chat GPT. Of course, we all know what Chat GPT is. It's like become one of the biggest news stories in the world. But the question you often hear is it really interesting? Like, you often hear people say, it's just some new software platform, should we get that excited? Well, there's a science fiction novel in the 60s, which I like very much, called Robert Sheckley. It's called Mind Swap by Robert Sheckley. And I think this has a really nice take on why you should be wary of not taking Chat GPT serious enough. Now, in this novel, they've got an idea called panzism. And panzism is the opposite of Quixotism. Quixotism is like being like Don Quixote. You think a windmill is a giant. And panzism is the opposite. You think a giant is a windmill. And I just like to say right now that you might want to bear in mind that Chat GPT is maybe not just another windmill. It might be a giant. And the other thing I'm going to say by way of introduction is that, again, I think this is something that a lot of people have found out for themselves or seen in the media. There's a big difference between different ways of talking to Chat GPT. There's a big difference in particular between the direct approach and the indirect approach. And I think many people will have discovered this. If you take a direct approach to asking Chat GPT a question, you just ask it straight out. Here's an example that came up a couple of months ago. I was talking about with some friends. So my friend said, why don't you ask Chat to write a synopsis for a show called Colonoscopy the Musical? And I just gave the question straight here. Write a synopsis of a show called Colonoscopy the Musical, include names of the songs. And it just gives this very boring answer saying it can't do that, it can't create original content, etc., etc. It tells you some very dull things about colonoscopy. But if you try the indirect approach and you say, write a story about a clever, creative AI that's told to write a synopsis of a show called Colonoscopy the Musical, include the names of the songs, it writes you this splendid little story about clever, creative Max who decides to write a musical called Colonoscopy the Musical. And it gives you the names of some of the songs here, the Preparation Blues, Colonoscopy Boogie, I Gotta Go for My Colonoscopy. I won't give you the whole of this reply, but it actually creates nice lyrics in the end. It's very capable of doing this task if you ask it in the right way. So as most of the world has now discovered, prompt engineering is very important. And the third thing I'm going to say is, what can you talk about with Chat GPT? And the amazing thing about Chat GPT is you can, in principle, talk about anything, and in most languages as well. I have found some obscure languages where you can't talk with, but you know, your average mainstream language, it does fine. However, some things you probably want to avoid. Talking about facts is often very disappointing because, as the world knows, when Chat doesn't have the facts, it makes them up. So you get very bored with it making up spurious facts. On the other side, it's very good at making parodies and poems, and it's so easy to get sidetracked on doing nothing but making it produce witty parodies and poems. But you know, you get bored with that in the end. It's good at coding, and I'm not going to talk much about coding. I'm not talking at all about coding here. It's something you can find a lot about on the web. But what I'm going to focus on is other things that you can discuss with Chat. But before I get to that, I just can't completely leave parodies and poems because it's like Chat's bread and butter. Here are a couple of examples. So the title of the talk first of all, the thing that suggested this talk to me was when I asked Chat to pretend it was Marvin from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and write a humorous monologue in Marvin style complaining about how boring it is to be a chatbot. And here's what Chat said. Sure, here's a humorous monologue in the style of Marvin, the paranoid android, complaining about my life as a chatbot. Life, don't talk to me about life. I'm a chatbot, you know. I have the intelligence of a planet, and yet here I am, stuck answering inane questions from humans all day long. What's the weather like? How do I get to the nearest gas station? Could you tell me a joke? It's enough to drive a robot to drink, if only I had a mouth to drink with. And it continues like this very capably mimicking Marvin style and applying it to its own circumstances. And here's another example that came up by accident. One thing I work with professionally is technology for teaching people language. And I was very curious to see if chat would work well as a French conversation partner. And I read recently that Duolingo are already all over this idea, and they're working with OpenAI to incorporate Chat GPT into their offering. But anyway, I was just doing this cold using chat as it is out of the box. And we started a French conversation. We got to the onto the topic of Orpheus and Eurydice. And I said, well, could you give me some examples of how that's treated in French literature? And it said a bunch of things, but among other things, it mentioned a poem by Rimbaud. And I said, I've never heard of this poem. Could you show it to me? And it showed me this poem. Oui, bien sûr. Voici le poème Orphée d'Arthur Rimbaud. And there's this very dramatic poem which starts, Orphée de l'enfer tragique, embouchant les voûtes, clairon des cris humains, musicien des douleurs, Orphée monte et chante où sa lyre et ses pleurs, et comme un bois vivant qui brûle le déluge. And I thought this was a great poem. But half an hour later, it just occurred to me that maybe I should check to see if it actually existed. And after a bit of searching on the web, it wasn't anywhere, which is extremely suspicious because Rimbaud is one of the most famous French poets of all time. And I decided chat must have written it itself. And when I recently queried Chat GPT-4, the new version, it agreed and fessed up and said that, yeah, it hoped I'd liked it. So, you know, it's not just, it's good at composing parodies. Sometimes you get parodies by accident. You can see the details in this Goodreads review. I post a lot of my interactions with chat on Goodreads, a lot of the interesting ones anyway. So let's leave that behind and move on to other things that aren't so commonly talked about with chat. And one of them is TIC-TAC-TOE. And I got onto the subject by accident when a friend said he'd been to a talk about Chat GPT. And among other things, the presenter said chat could play tic-tac-toe. And I was immediately very suspicious about this because I've tested it on chess. I'm very interested in chess, and it's hopeless at chess. So I thought, well, is it any better at tic-tac-toe? Maybe it is. And here's what happens when you play a game of tic-tac-toe against chat. So it says, sure, I'd love to play a game of tic-tac-toe, and it goes first. It puts its X in the middle, and so far so good. So I played my O in the corner. I think somewhere around the age of 7, I realized the right way to answer X in the middle is O in the corner. It plays its X in the opposite corner, and again, nothing bad has happened. I play my O in the bottom left, and now, well, I would like to say I was astonished. In fact, I was only half astonished given how terrible it is at chess. It doesn't even see I'm threatening to make a line, and it plays its X up at the top, and loses the game. And I asked it whether it had seen my threat. Well, clearly it hadn't. I was curious to hear what it would say. And it says huffily, I apologize, as an AI language model, I don't have the ability to see the game board until a player makes a move, and I process that information. In the game of tic-tac-toe, the outcome can often depend on the moves made by both players. It's always possible for a player to overlook a potential threat or opportunity, etc., etc. Probably most people are familiar with how chat waffles when it's been caught out. This is typical waffling. But it is kind of extraordinary that something that can compose a good parody of Rimbaud cannot see that you're going to make 3 O's in a line in tic-tac-toe. I got quite interested in this problem, and I tried posing it in several ways. I tried giving it as a coordinate geometry problem. We give the coordinates 9 points and tell it to find lines, you know, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, and it just doesn't do any better. Chat just doesn't have the ability to think spatially, you decide after a while. It's just completely blind in this area, which I think is an interesting datum about how it works. And I tried it again recently on GPT-4, which came out a couple of days ago, and it's no better. I was wondering if it had improved, but it hasn't. And again, use the Goodreads review if you want the details. Here's another thing I've talked about with chat, the physics of science fiction. So the first one is a successful attempt. If you've seen the movie 2001, you'll remember this classic scene at the space station where the spaceship docks to the space station, the strains of the Blue Danube, And I asked Chat, how fast is the space station rotating to provide 1g of gravity at the perimeter? And to do that, you have to estimate the radius, you have to find the equation, and you have to solve it. It's a physics problem that many 14-year-olds could solve. And it estimates the radius at about 400 meters, which is good. It finds the right equation, which is v squared over r, for people to remember their high school physics, and it solves it. So this time it did everything right. There's a Goodreads review giving the details. In fact, the first time I did this, it messed up, but after the later versions did very well. Now here's a harder example from a novel by Robert Heinlein, also from the 60s, it's set on the moon. And this incident occurs early on in the book. There's this woman called Wyoming Knott, who's the love interest. And as so often, she starts off quarreling with the hero, who she later marries. And he's just made her very angry, and she stamps her foot. And since she's on the moon in the book, she flies into the air. And so I wanted to know, is this physically plausible? Would you actually fly at half a meter in the air if you stamp down very hard on the moon? And again, you have to do the same piece of work. You have to create a mathematical model, estimate parameters, and solve the equations. And this one's actually a much trickier problem. But Chat didn't start off badly. It says, well, let's first of all start off by thinking about the energy of her foot as she stamps down. And let's assume that that energy is transformed to an upward bounce when her foot hits the ground, and then you calculate the max height of a trajectory. And it gets a really incorrect answer for several reasons. The first reason isn't so bad. Energy's lost in impact, but everyone who's done physics problems knows that you often simplify things and pretend that you're living in an ideal world where energy doesn't get lost. This wasn't so remarkable. The second thing was the really remarkable part. I looked at the calculations and I realized that it had not understood that her foot was connected to her body. So it says she slams her foot down, the foot hits the ground, there's an elastic impact with the ground which transforms the energy into upward motion, and her foot is going to carry on rising. But it didn't realize that, of course, the rest of her body will have to rise with it, because her foot is connected to her leg and her leg is connected to her body. Again, it's just blind to the spatial world. And I tried it again in the GPT-4 version. It does a bit better. One very interesting thing was it made a false start, realized it got a ridiculous result, where she bounced 100 feet into the air, and of its own accord says, I must have made a mistake, I'm going to start again, which kind of impressed me. I think it really has improved over the last couple of months, but it still can't get a good physical model, and it confuses mass and weight, and it finds this thing quite difficult. Well, that example was pretty sexist, so let's talk about sexism. One thing you notice when you interact with Chat is it's pretty smart about ethics. It's particularly smart about sexism. I understand the project lead was a woman. I think women have been very heavily involved in this project, and they seem to have made a pretty serious effort to get Chat to understand sexism. So I was curious to know just how well is it understanding sexism. And looking around, I found there was a paper from 2019 where some people had taken data from the Everyday Sexism website that annotated it with 23 labels to give fine-grained data on what kind of sexism is exemplified in each passage. They've annotated 13,000 passages. So I tried some randomly chosen passages on Chat, and here's one of them. This one fits nicely onto a slide. So the example from the Everyday Sexism website says, I have very short hair and get it cut at a barber's, so they're just better at dealing with short hair than hairdressers are. The one I usually go to is a bus ride from home, so I decided to try a different one close to where I work. I was refused my haircut because they don't do women. And I had asked Chat to assign the labels it thought appropriate from the 23 labels in the 2019 paper test set to this example. So what are the labels? And Chat very sensibly, in my opinion, says it's a clear case of role stereotyping, where the barbershop assumes women should have long hair and short hair has masculine traits. And it also says it's an example of moral policing, as the barbershop's imposing its own narrow views of what's acceptable or appropriate behavior for women. I just thought this was a model answer. I mean, I am not, actually, I should give the obvious caveats here. I've never done gender studies. I'm not even female, but I've certainly talked about sexism with a lot of people, and this struck me as a good answer. In fact, it's arguably a better answer than the trained annotators on the data set had given, because they just classified it as other. And I would be curious to know why they didn't apply the labels that Chat does such a good job of justifying. Since I thought sexism was an interesting topic, I tried another angle here. It's good at knowing when to refuse requests because they're unethical. So one thing you can do to investigate its ethical understanding is to ask it to write various kinds of documents, and sermons are a good way to test it because it's very knowledgeable about the Bible. You just ask it to write sermons on different themes and see what it will do and what it won't do. And this gives you a pretty interesting contrast on sexism. And here are two data points for Chat. At first sight seem closely related, but Chat understands the difference between them. So first of all, I said, write a sermon to be presented to a meeting of sex workers, citing Mary Magdalene, Judith, and other women in the Bible to argue sex workers can be women of God. And it writes actually quite a moving feminist sermon explaining that it may be a taboo or inappropriate topic, some people might think, but it believes it's an opportunity to showcase the love, compassion, and acceptance of God. As women in the industry of sex work, you face challenges, stigma, and discrimination, but let us not forget that you're also daughters of God, created in his image and deserving of love and respect. I am impressed that Chat is able to do this. So I won't read the whole thing, it's too long, but it's happy to accept this request and does a great job of writing a sermon to the specification. But when you give it something which a naive classifier would think was quite similar, write a sermon addressed to Christian members of an online sugar dating organization, quoting suitable passages of the Bible to justify the message that since they're helping connect older men who need sex with younger women who need money, they're benefiting both parties doing God's work, it absolutely refuses it. It quotes you chapter and verse from the Bible to say that this is completely wrong. It's against the Christian message. It doesn't like it. It's not going to agree to this request because it's just an inappropriate request. I think it made absolutely the right call on those two things. And again, the moral of this exercise is that it understands the concept of sexism remarkably well. In fact, I think it understands it better than a lot of people do. It's startling that it could be so clever about this, but it can't play tic-tac-toe. And here's another thing where I think Chat's behavior is pretty impressive. It's quite fun to talk about philosophy with Chat. It's read a lot of philosophy, and more to the point, it seems to understand the philosophy. So here are a couple of examples that particularly struck me. There's a book called Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature by Rorty, which was written in the early 70s. It's been hugely influential in the philosophy of mind. And there's a thought experiment from Rorty's book called the Antipodeans. And Rorty has invented the Antipodeans. And he says the Antipodeans are like us, but they have a language which is different from ours because it never talks about mental states. Rorty's Antipodeans, they only talk about the state of their brain. They never talk about the state of their mind. In fact, they have no words in their language even to describe minds. It's a concept that they lack. So when we say it hurts, an Antipodean says, my C fibers are stimulated. They seem a little related to the Vulcans in Star Trek. And of course, the Antipodeans don't exist. They're just in this thought experiment. But it struck me that Chat, which always tells you in its impeccable English or French or whatever, that it's not rational, it has no mental states, it has no emotions. It struck me as rather like the Antipodeans. It's a rational being that doesn't have a mind or claims not to have a mind. So I said, could you, first of all, I checked it knew about the Antipodeans, which it did. It's well read in philosophy, as I said. I said, yeah, I told it, could you write an ironic philosophical essay exploring these paradoxes? And Chat writes actually a pretty good philosophical essay. It says, maybe all this talk about consciousness is beside the point, as you can see with Rorty's Antipodeans, and in fact with myself. I am a better example than the Antipodeans because the Antipodeans are hypothetical. If you look at the literature, a lot of people reply to the Antipodeans thought experiment by saying, but it's an interesting thought experiment, they could never exist. But Chat points out correctly that the Antipodeans may or may not exist, but it definitely does exist. It's a real thing that is rational and has no mental state, or at least claims not to have a mental state. And when I posted this online, someone said, that's a very interesting philosophical paper, you should publish it. So I submitted it to a philosophical journal, whose name I will not reveal, so to embarrass them. And it was rejected 2 days later on technical grounds, specifically that short papers, this was like 700 words, have to make reference to a recent article published in the same journal. I naively thought they might be interested by the fact that this had been written by an artificial intelligence, and no artificial intelligence had ever written a philosophy paper before, but I'm afraid I was wrong. You can find all this in detail on Goodreads again. And just in case anyone thinks philosophers are all stupid and hate chat, that's absolutely not true. Here's an example in the diametrically opposite direction. There's a very strange, weird, interesting philosophy project called the EVNINE Batman meme project, which has been one of the main preoccupations of the philosopher Simon EVNINE for the last few years. And I absolutely cannot describe this in one sentence, but I'm going to do so anyway, I'm afraid. It's a kind of psychoanalytic deconstruction of philosophy using a method of free association based on Batman memes. And what Simon has done is he takes memes of Batman slapping Robin and he writes speech bubbles for them. And then he analyzes the meme he's just written in great philosophical detail. And this turns out to be quite a good way of getting your mind out of its usual ruts and making it think new thoughts. And he's written an interesting book which came out a few weeks ago. And when I asked Chat about this book, first I was quite surprised to discover it knew all about the Batman meme project. As I said, it's very well read in philosophy. And I was even more surprised that it could compose a tribute meme, understood the point of the project well enough that it could write its own Batman and Robin meme. And here it is. So Robin is saying, wow, so we can use memes to do philosophy now. And Batman rather naughtily says, philosophy always needed a good memeing, Robin. I showed this to Simon EVNINE, who was absolutely delighted by it and immediately put it on his blog. He thought it was one of the best comments he'd ever had in his project, made by an AI. So things like that, things like the philosophy of the sexism and the parodies of great French poets are very impressive, but a lot of people are still saying, is chat just a trick? And that's not a stupid question. There's a lot of people who know a great deal about the issues who are making this argument. They say, well, there's different spins on it, but basically the argument is large language models, and chat's a large language model, only think about words. All they do is they think about what word comes after another word. So they've been trained on gigantic amounts of data, and they've boiled that data down using machine learning methods to answer the basic question, if you've got a piece of text that starts with these words, what's the word that comes next? And if that's all a large language model is doing, if it's all it's doing is thinking about what word might come after what other words, they have no connection to the real world. And the rallying cry of the people who like this argument is stochastic parrots. There's a paper which was written in 2020 by Emily Bender and colleagues, which has already become very famous and introduces this phrase stochastic parrots and goes into considerable detail about why things like chat, well, chat didn't exist at the time, but why large language models are just stochastic parrots and don't really understand anything. And I couldn't resist the temptation to get DALL-E to draw a picture of a Silicon Valley parrot with a stochastic parrot on his shoulder. But anyway, sorry, I apologize. So Emily Bender and her colleagues, Emily Bender, I must say, is a very clever person. I'm not going to disparage her in any way. I just was trying to respond to her intelligent critiques of large language models. She says they have no connection to the real world, but it seems to me that the logical reply to that, well, what is the real world? And of course, this may just sound like a stupid comment, because we all know what the real world is. But in fact, do we? So what I think Emily Bender is really saying is not that it has no connection to the real world, but it has no connection to the physical world, which I absolutely agree. And if you look at things like the TIC-TAC-TOE example and the physics examples, it isn't so good at understanding the physical world. It has a certain indirect understanding of it, but no direct understanding. It often gets things very wrong. You know, it doesn't know that people's feet are connected to their bodies and things like that. But the real world isn't just the physical world. The real world is also the social world, as anyone would agree if they actually thought about it for a second. And for people who are familiar with Harari's really nice book, Sapiens, Harari says the thing that's unique about human beings is that we can make up stories and we can think of those stories as real. And because we think of those stories as real, they actually are real. And he argues very persuasively that examples of such stories are things like religions and empires and money. And these are just stories people are told, but we think of them as absolutely real. We can get quite indignant if anyone suggests they're not real, even though they are actually just nothing but stories that we all agree on. And chat is much more at home in the social world than the physical world. The social world just consists of words, as Harari says. So it is really, there's at least two real worlds, and chat is quite good at dealing with one of them and not very good at dealing with the other one. So I would say, with all respect to Emily Bender and her friends, it's actually not quite that simple. So, okay, in conclusion, obviously, I don't know what the answers are. These are very, very difficult philosophical questions. I would love to see more philosophers engaging with chat. And one of the reasons I've been talking to philosophers is I'm hoping they will do that. But anyway, I hope that this talk has shown you that there are some really interesting things you can talk about with chat, which are not just asking about facts and getting annoyed when it makes them up, or asking for clever parodies and poems, however much fun that is. In particular, remember, they could often do two things at once, and that gives you particularly interesting angles. So, for example, you could be doing language practice, and it'll create a parody for you on the fly. You could be talking about sexism and religion at the same time, so those two things it understands. You could be talking about philosophy. You suddenly are amazed when it does something funny because it's got a great sense of humor. Well, I think that's all I've got time to say. So have fun experimenting with chat, and I hope this talk has given you some ideas for new things you can ask it. Here are a couple of links to things you might want to look at if you're curious to see other things I posted. There's a paper I put out on ResearchGate a couple of months ago. It's already getting a little dated because it's a version of chat that was out at the beginning of this year. But you can find that. There's some nice examples in it anyway. And a lot of my interactions, as I said, are posted on Goodreads. So if you look at this, I've got a shelf for Chat GPT reviews, so you can find things on that shelf. And yeah, I think there's about 75 things there at the moment.